Welcome to Food for Thought, the place to explore, celebrate, and manifest a life motivated and defined by unconditional compassion and optimal wellness. Today's episode is labeling wine, sustainable, organic, vegan, and more. Before we begin, my name is Patrick-Goudreau. You can find me at joyfulvegan.com, and on social media, you can find my books wherever books are sold. This podcast is possible because of the support of listeners like you. There are no sponsors or ads on Food for Thought, and with your help, we can keep doing that. If that's something you value, please join other supporters by going to patreon.com/ColleenPatrick-Goudreau to become a supporter today at your chosen level. One of the perks is discounts to my virtual cooking classes and also transcripts of each and every episode. So be sure to check your Patreon account for those coupon codes and for those transcripts. And thank you in advance for supporting this podcast, for subscribing to it, and for listening to it. And speaking of cooking classes, I am offering one more virtual class before the year is over. I'm recording this at the end of 2021, 15 years into this podcast, still recording. So join me for the joy of holiday baking, which includes melt-in-your-mouth meringues, yes, meringues without eggs, cinnamon rolls, gingerbread cookies, and holiday nog. You can register at joyfulvegan.com/classes. I will be teaching the class just a couple days before I fly to Cape Town, South Africa, to start our Cape Town and Botswana trip. So I'm going to have to give the treats to our kitty sitter if I don't want to eat them all myself. And speaking of trips, as of this writing, again, this is the end of 2021, Northern Italy for June 2022 is 100% a go. We have only one double room left, and sadly, no more single rooms. Rwanda, November 2022 is 100% a go. We just announced this to everyone who has put their deposit down. And Rwanda has 4 double rooms left. Tuscany, June 2022 is filling up. So first is Tuscany, next June, and then is Northern Italy. So some people signed up for both, which you can still do while there's that double room in Northern Italy. But Tuscany has 4 double rooms left, and there is only 1 single room left for a single traveler. Anyway, it's all on the website. And as you can see, these trips are filling up quickly. They all have deadlines for booking. So any and all of these trips, if they sound remotely intriguing to you, don't hesitate. So as I said, Rwanda and Northern Italy are 100% a go. They're going to happen. They're happening. In the case of Tuscany, we haven't reached our minimum number of bookings yet. So you need to sign up now, but you can't lose. If the trip doesn't happen, you get 100% of your deposit back. And if the trip happens, we're going to Tuscany together. Check out my social media, especially Instagram and Facebook, for the photos from our Tuscany 2021 trip, and go to joyfulvegantrips.com for all of the information you need, the entire itineraries, everything you need to answer your questions about this trip. It's an incredible itinerary. I can't wait to travel with you. And not for nothing, but the food we ate at our vegan Tuscan villa called I Pini was some of the best food I've ever eaten in my life, every single meal. And I'm not exaggerating. And I will also be teaching a cooking demo when we're there. So also, here's a segue for you. We drank some of the most wonderful wine when we were in Tuscany, made just down the road from our villa. And we also toured a Tuscan winery that prides itself on not using animal products in the making of their wines. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Wine and all of the different ways you can label wine and what all of those different labels mean. Okay, I'm a wine drinker. I don't hide it. My husband's a wine drinker. We enjoy drinking wine together. Many of our friends are wine drinkers, and I have received numerous questions over the years about what we drink, how do we know it's vegan, what's the difference between vegan wine and sustainable wine, what about wine labeled natural, biodynamic, organic, what's your favorite wine, what are your favorite California wines, California wineries, Italian wines, French wines. etc., etc. I should also add South African wines and Australian wines in there as well. And of course, in the United States, there's more than just one wine region, obviously. We're in California, so we drink a lot of California wines, but there's also Washington and Idaho and Oregon and New York. And wine making regions are just popping up all over the United States. But we're going to focus on the ones that are the most traditional, which are obviously European wines and California wines. But we have lots to talk about. So I thought it was high time to make a podcast episode on this huge topic, no pressure, and clarify at least a few things. Now, keep in mind that there are a myriad, read hot mess of certifications for wine. And while labeling is important and truth in labeling is paramount, it's really easy to get bogged down in and very confused by all the different labels meant to satisfy disparate groups of people in the marketplace. Labels can be helpful, but they can also create confusion. Labels can be helpful, but they can also be meaningless. So you'll see what I mean when I start explaining things. And in the end, you may wind up feeling, hopefully by the end, you feel empowered to make your own informed decisions. And I suspect at the end, you're also going to feel that, like with so many things in this imperfect world, in the end, all we can do is the best we can do. And that's still a lot better than most. Before we get into the different certifications, I mentioned sustainable, biodynamic, natural, organic, vegan. Let's start with the foundations of winemaking. We're going to do a little winemaking 101 here, so we're on the same page about the processes involved and why there are all these different designations. Why do we need them in the first place? So I think you might find this interesting if you've never really thought about the whole process of winemaking. Even if you're not a wine drinker, I mean, it's just so interesting to take this agricultural crop, this grape, and turn it into this fermented alcoholic beverage. So there are 5 basic stages or steps to making wine. There's harvesting, there's crushing and pressing, there's fermentation, there's clarification, and then there's aging and bottling. I'm grouping both of those together. Now let's start with the first stage, which would be harvesting. Now it goes without saying, and yet I'm saying it, that wine is an agricultural product, which means as such, it's a cultivated crop. Cultivating grapes for winemaking is called viticulture. So I may use that term a couple times throughout this episode. The grapes used for making wine are the common European grape, also known as, well, in Latin, it would be called the Vitis vinifera. Vitis, V-I-T-I-S, is the genus. And there are as many as 60 different species of Vitis, right? The most famous of which is the Vitis vinifera. It originated in Europe, specifically in the Caucasus, which is a region between the Black and Caspian Seas. It includes southwest Russia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. And in fact, very recently, David and I visited a really special winery in Amador County in California. It's called Story, S-T-O-R-Y, and they specialize in Georgian wines. I think National Geographic recently had a piece that identified Georgia, the country of Georgia, as the original place for wine. It's where wine was first made, was in Georgia. And so this particular winery called Story really pride themselves on their traditional winemaking. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But when I talk about traditional winemaking, we're talking about, in their case, wine that is made by winemakers that have as little of their hands in the process as possible. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to natural wines. So wine grapes are different from table grapes. They're smaller, they're sweeter, and they have a lot of seeds. There are over 1,300 wine grape varieties used in commercial production, but only about 100 of these varieties make up 75% of the world's vineyards in the making of wine. So you've heard of Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc, Zinfandel, Merlot. I mean, you've heard of all of these. You've probably heard of, at least 10, I would imagine, but about 100 of these varieties make up 75% of the world's vineyards. Okay, so once the grapes are ripe, and different grapes in different regions have different harvest times, some from as early as July to as late as October. And this is a key component of winemaking when they are harvested. So once the grapes are ripe, they're harvested. Sometimes they're harvested by hand, sometimes using special machines, and then they're brought to the winery as quickly as possible. Of course, you don't want the grapes to start fermenting themselves, right? So they're brought to the winery as quickly as possible, and they're sorted by hand to remove any unwanted material. Now, at this time, they're also either stemmed completely or stemmed partially or not stemmed at all, depending again on the winemaker and on the type of grape. So this also happens during this sorting and separating process, getting rid of things you don't want, kind of little sediment or things that are in these big batches of grape clusters that they get. And also, again, making the decision about whether they're going to ferment these grapes with their stems on or not. And that is, we're not going to get into that level of detail, but that's what's happening at this stage. Now, white wine grapes are pressed first immediately to separate the juice from the skins and seeds, and then it's fermented. So that's the difference. That's one of the main differences between white wine and red wine, is the white wine grapes are, again, pressed first to separate that juice from the skins and seeds before fermentation. Red wine grapes are fermented with their skins and their seeds, and they're pressed a little later on. In fact, all the color you see in a glass of red wine comes from the phytochemical anthocyanin found in dark purple grape skins. That's that wonderful phytochemical you would have heard of. If you have my book, Color Me Vegan, you would have heard of it elsewhere, obviously, as well. I talk all about the protective properties in such plants as blueberries, blackberries, bilberries, grapes, and more that have this dark purple color, this anthocyanin. And it's these phytonutrients, along with resveratrol, which act as antioxidants, that make wine drinking one of the healthy habits of people living in places like the Mediterranean, but also living in blue zones. Now, if you haven't heard of blue zones, you may have heard of blue zones. Dan Buettner, he wrote a book called The Blue Zones, and he wanted to figure out what the habits were, if there were common threads in the regions and the cultures and the peoples who live in the world's longest living cultures. So regions where individuals live to be over 100 years old. And he found that people, and there's obviously different habits. So one of the main habits is eating as many plant-based foods as possible. Another habit he found, in 4 original blue zone areas, people drink alcohol moderately and daily. And if you're asking, yes, because of their red skins, red wines contain more beneficial compounds than white, but this is one of the reasons why wine drinking, and it's mostly red wine, tends to be one of the habits of very healthy people in these blue zones. So that's interesting. Now, after the harvest, grapes head to the winery, as I said, where the winemaker then starts to prepare the grapes for fermentation. This is after the grapes have been sorted through. And it's at this stage, it's during this time, the grapes may also receive sulfur dioxide to stop bacterial spoilage before the fermentation starts. Now, the United States is one of the only countries, along with Australia, that requires bottles to label sulfite contents. And anticipation of any questions you may be thinking, or any questions that you might submit to me, I want to answer first and foremost. Number 1, sulfites are not bad for you unless you're sensitive to them. And number 2, sulfites are not the cause of red wine headaches unless you're sensitive to them. So people talk about sulfites in wine a lot, right? It's kind of like the protein question for vegans. But if you look at the sulfur content or the sulfites content in wine versus other foods, they're actually quite lower than in a lot of other processed foods people are eating, especially like packaged animal flesh, prepared soups, soda, frozen juices, French fries, dried fruit. There are a lot more sulfites in all of those things, and people are eating those on a regular basis. I'm not saying you should eat those things on a regular basis. I'm just saying that there are fewer sulfites in wine than people think, right? There's more protein in plants than people think. There are fewer sulfites in wine than people think. And the process of using sulfites in wine has been around for as long as, since ancient times. Ancient Rome used to use sulfur as a preservative in wine. It started to be used in commercial winemaking in the early 1900s to stop bacteria again and other yeasts from growing. That's why sulfur dioxide is used. So next, I digressed. Next, once you harvest the grapes, pick them through, press them immediately if you're making white wine. It's time to move on to the next step, which is preparing them for fermentation. They may have already received sulfur dioxide now, and now they're ready for fermentation. And that's where yeast is needed to eat the grape sugars and make alcohol, right? That's how we get alcohol. The yeasts come either from a commercial packet, just like you might find in bread making, or they might occur spontaneously in the juice. Now remember this too, because this is going to come in handy when we talk about natural wines. Commercial yeasts allow winemakers to produce very consistent wines year in and year out. Naturally occurring yeasts are more challenging to deal with, and they produce less consistent wines. But we'll talk about that when we get to these labels. As the yeast start to convert the sugar into alcohol, the juice is released from the grapes, and all the skins start lifting up to the top of the tank by the carbon dioxide that's being produced. And now, depending on the winemaker and the winery and the grape, frankly, the grape skins are either punched down or they're stirred back into the fermenting juice. Now, this differs by winemaker to winemaker, but just so you know, that's part of the process too. Those skins start lifting up as the yeast start to convert the sugar to alcohol. You've got all this carbon dioxide, so the wines start to rise to the top, and then they're punched down again. And eventually, once this fermentation process is complete, the vintner, or the winemaker, drains the freely running wine from the tank, and they put the remaining skins into a wine press. You can get like 15% more wine by pressing those skins to get more juice out of it, to get more wine. And depending on the wine, a second fermentation may take place, whereby a little microbe converts the sharp tasting malic acid into creamier, chocolatey lactic acid. So nearly all red wines go through malolactic fermentation. This is that second fermentation, but only a few white wines do, such as Chardonnay. So malolactic fermentation is responsible for Chardonnay's very creamy and buttery flavors, which is one of the reasons I do not like Chardonnay. It is my least favorite wine. Okay, so that's the fermentation process. Then you get all of the wine, from the tanks into individual barrels, and that's what is next. You've got the aging process. Depending on the type of wine being made, they would be moved to barrels where they would age from as few as a couple months to years. Now, this aging process, which is also called élevage, can happen in wooden barrels, can happen in concrete barrels, can happen in glass, can happen in clay, stainless steel tanks. It really depends, again, on the winemaker and what kind of wine is being made. And each vessel affects the wine differently as it ages. And next, you've got the blending process. This is when the winemaker blends grape varieties together. You have different grape varieties together. That's why you see blends. You might have a bottle that's, 65% Zinfandel and 15% Merlot. This is the time that happens. Or they blend different barrels of the same grape to make a finished wine. Because, again, oxidation is the great enemy of wine, or really any, again, produce, to prevent the wine from oxidizing, sulfur dioxide might be added again at this time. And as we discussed, it's an antioxidant. It can also act as an antimicrobial. Next, depending on how quickly you want to get that wine to market, you would fine or filter your wine. Now we're going to come back to fining and filtering wine. This has to do with the animal products, so you might be interested in this part. So remember those terms, fining and filtering. And finally, bottling. I shouldn't say finally, because I guess labeling would be the final stage, but bottling is next, and bottle aging. And again, depending on what kind of wine you're making, some might age longer in the bottle. And that, again, I'm not going into that level of detail. Now, labeling is important for our conversation today. And, honestly, David and I tend to be California wine drinkers, but we started really learning about European wines, and the labeling of European wines is so different than in the United States. So complicated, so complicated, especially Italian wines. French wines, I feel like I finally got a handle on it, but Italian wines, forget about it. It's so complicated. So that is for your own interest to go down that rabbit hole of understanding wine labeling. But typically, wine labels have the wine producer or the vineyard name, the year it was produced, the region where the grapes were grown, and the type of grape, right? So you can learn a lot about the wine inside the bottle by reading the label, or not, if it's as confusing to you as it is to me, but you can't find out everything. Different countries have different labeling standards. It's one of the things that makes it so confusing, and they're regulated by different government bodies depending on the country. When it comes to the kinds of things we're talking about today, the FDA, that's the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States, doesn't regulate certifications or terminology on wine labels. So unlike with many other foods, there are no ingredients labels on a bottle of wine. You won't find ingredients listed. So that's why I'm here for you. That's why I'm doing this podcast episode, to talk to you about what the different labels mean that are outside of, like I said, the name of the grape, the producer, but what these terms mean that you might be interested in because you want to make an informed decision about what kind of wine you're buying, aside from what type of grape was it. And today, this episode is meant to give you an idea of the different practices related to the growing, the harvesting, the fermenting, the fining and filtering, and the labeling of wines. And it goes without saying, though I'm going to say it, that in the end, the decisions we make about living as compassionately and sustainably and healthfully as possible is still about doing the best we can. It's not about trying to reach some level of perfection. It's impossible in this world. It's an imperfect world. And it's certainly not about obtaining some kind of vegan certification. There is no such thing, as you will find out. But don't do nothing because you can't do everything, right? Do something, anything. So here we are. So now that you know the different steps involved in the making of wine, it will make a lot more sense when I talk about these different practices and certifications, because the certifications and the regulatory bodies, it's all related to all of the processes I just named. So you have to understand why something is certified X. You have to understand, well, that has to do with the fermentation process, or that has to do with the filtering process, or that has to do with the harvesting stage. So I wanted to give you all of those stages, that kind of winemaking 101, so you understand what we're going to talk about next. So next, we're going to start with these labels, and we're going to start with sustainable, which is a very broad term, to be sure, but one that does have a specific meaning when it comes to grape growing and wine making. And then we're going to move on to organic, biodynamic, natural, and vegan. So sustainable wine refers both to the farming and the winemaking practices that wine growers follow. And there are certifications that wineries and vineyards can apply for and pay for. And while those certifications tend to be offered region by region, we're going to talk about that, and the criteria vary depending on the region. In all cases, in order to be certified sustainable, wineries and vineyards must have an independent third party evaluate their practices to see if they meet certain eco-friendly standards, right? So again, I want to just make it clear. I'm talking about grape growing and wine making. Those are two different things. Now, sometimes the person or winery that makes the wine also grow the grapes. You're going to have a viticulturist do that, though. You're going to have, this is an agricultural product, so you're going to have farmers basically doing that, but who really understand and have studied viticulture. again, wine grapes. And sometimes they're doing it themselves. Sometimes they employ their own, viticulturists. Sometimes they have their own estate wines. So, or sometimes they contract out the vineyards. We're going to talk about that. But the point is, when we're talking about how wine is made, there are so many different levels. Obviously, you've just heard some stages, but we have to talk about farming and wine making separately. And some of these certifications have to do just with the wine making, and some of these certifications have to do mostly with the grape growing, and some have to do with both. So sustainable as a label tends to refer both to the farming and the wine making practices, okay? Now these standards run the gamut. Now let's talk about the vineyards. Let's talk about the grape growing. Run the gamut of composting waste to make fertilizer, conserving water, reducing energy consumption, reducing pesticide use or not using pesticides at all, providing support for beneficial predators and beneficial just insects, right? Using cover crops to contribute to nutrients back into the soil, creating buffer crops of flowers for pollinators. So these are some of the things that a sustainable-minded viticulturist or a winery will consider when they call themselves sustainable or when they talk about the sustainable practices. So for instance, in California, I mentioned that there were different certifications based on region. In California, there's a certification called Certified California Sustainable Wine Growing, CCSW. It's the largest of the sustainable certifications, and it places an emphasis on the production of high-quality California wine. The Certified Sustainable Seal, which is issued by the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance, covers multiple aspects of a winery's operations, from the vineyard all the way to the winemaking process. So things I just named, those cover crops, the buffer crops, the supporting beneficial insects and predators, right? Utilizing integrated pest management to reduce the amount of pesticides, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, providing employee educational benefits. So it doesn't have to just do with environmental conditions and environmental standards. It also has to do with how the workers are treated. So that is an aspect of the sustainable label. It was established in 2010, this CCSW, the Certified California Sustainable Wine Growing Certification. And producers under this label can have their vineyard, their winery, or both certified sustainable, because again, we're talking about everything from cradle to grave, if you will. What happens in the vineyard is as important as what happens in the winery. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about sustainability and how a wine is made. Now, there's another kind of certification. It also started in California. I mean, obviously, a lot of these sustainable certifications started in California, not surprisingly, because California tends to be minded towards sustainability, sustainability minded. I guess that would be the way to say it. And also, it's California, so it's a huge winemaking state. It's a huge winemaking region, or there are huge winemaking regions in California. So there's another one called Sustainability in Practice, and that's the acronym is SIP. And that began as a regional effort in California's Central Coast area in 2008, and then they expanded throughout the state. And now they're starting to certify vineyards elsewhere, even outside of California. So SIP certified is something you would see on the label. Now, again, this sustainability practice includes not only environmental efforts, but also labor practices and worker support. So, and a lot of the worker support and labor practices are related to the farming aspects. So that is something you should know if you are looking for sustainable criteria when you're choosing your wine, that it also has to do with labor practices. There are smaller certifications in California. There's Lodi rules that obviously are related to and started in the Lodi region. There's also something called Napa Green. In the Pacific Northwest, there's Salmon Safe. So you're starting to see the issue here, right? I've already named 5 different certifications for sustainability, and each one of them are going to have different criteria for actually getting those labels or having the certifications on your wine label. Speaking of the Pacific Northwest, these are wines made in Oregon and Washington and Idaho. You've got a certification in addition to the small one I mentioned, the Salmon Safe. You've also got a certification called, again, the acronym is LIVE, and it stands for Low Input Viticulture and Enology. Enology refers to the study and the making of wine. So Low Input Viticulture and Enology, acronym is LIVE. That's another certification for sustainability, and that also supports environmentally and socially responsible wine growing through third-party certification and education. So as you can probably detect, when you're looking at sustainable certification programs, the focus tends to be on the agricultural practices, such as supporting and protecting native habitat, wildlife, watershed quality, biodiversity, right? Because again, grape growing is an agricultural endeavor, and it's important to farm responsibly and sustainably, both for the earth and for future generations. But sustainable also tends to refer to social issues such as worker health and safety, as well as good neighbor policies. Now, for instance, Benziger Family Winery in Sonoma, California, we've been there. It's one of the most well-known sustainable vineyards in the United States. Again, it's Benziger, Benziger. They practice sustainability by promoting more biodiversity in their vineyards, that is supporting a variety of life in a particular habitat or ecosystem. So, for instance, they don't spray Roundup to kill leafhoppers, right? Because leafhoppers would obviously destroy the crops. They created insectaries. And so these are plants that attract pests to keep them off the crops, the crop being the vineyards, the grapes, the grapevines. And they encourage the prevalence of birds in order to keep pests down. They also have a water saving system where they recycle millions of gallons of water as a result. They have solar panels. They have energy efficient equipment in their winery. So they do a lot in terms of sustainability. The problem is we didn't love their wine. I really wanted to so badly. We've tried it a number of times and we'll drink it, but we didn't become members, just put it that way. That's one of our barometers for loving a wine, is when we become members of a winery. So many sustainable wineries also follow organic and biodynamic farming practices, which we're going to get to next. But not all organic and biodynamic wines are automatically sustainable. So now you have this whole group, I just named this whole group of sustainable, right? Sustainable tends to include organic practices, tends to include biodynamic practices, but not all the time. Obviously, incorporates sustainable and kind of eco-minded practices when it comes to farming. But just because something's organic doesn't mean it's actually practicing those sustainable practices I just named. So what does it mean to be organic? Let's move there next. Certified organic wines, they must meet the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA, their National Organic Program criteria in both farming and production, as well as requirements set by the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. That's who regulates wine. At its core, the organic program also includes protection of natural resources and the promotion of biodiversity, but also, it's about limiting the use of synthetic products, especially in the vineyards, so synthetic herbicides, for instance. In order for a wine to be certified USDA organic, the grapes used in the wine must be organic. And the winemaking process also needs to be organic, so I'll explain. This means that not only are the grapes to be grown without the use of pesticides or GMOs, but everything that goes into the wine, including the yeast, right, used for that fermentation process, the yeast must also be certified organic. Naturally occurring sulfites are permitted, but sulfite additives are not allowed. This is just a small sample of the protocol, but as you can imagine, with any kind of certification process, well, I shouldn't say any, but with a good one or with a rigorous one, it is an arduous process. It's a 3-year process during which producers have to transition vineyards by discontinuing any use of prohibited substances. And this tends to be a deterrent for some producers, even if they follow the standards. So I just want to remind you, and we've talked about this when we've just talked about produce that you buy at the market, right? Just because something's like isn't labeled USDA organic or even labeled organic doesn't mean they're not following organic practices. Now, the labels help you know that. It's the quick way to look at a product and say, oh, that's organic. But I mean, even when we go to the farmer's market, there are farmers that are certified USDA organic, but there are ones that aren't. And when we ask them, and they also have kind of on their signs that they are organic and they don't use pesticides, that's the point, is that they are practicing organic standards. They just didn't go through the certification process. For some farms, it's very expensive as well. And it depends on how large or small these farms are, whether they're farming grapes for winemaking or they're farming produce for us to eat, right? So that's something to consider. That's one of the reasons why I said labels can be problematic, they can be confusing, they can be meaningless, they can be helpful. It's all of these things. So experts will say, I've talked to a lot of different winemakers, and we don't follow wine literature that closely, but we watch and read a number of wine experts. And they will say that while organic sounds good in practice, the quality of the wine can suffer, because to make wine, you do have to have a lot of human intervention. This is the difference between like the winery we went to that specialized in the Georgian wine. They pride themselves on having like very little human intervention at all, which means you're going to have a very inconsistent experience. And that can be exciting and fun, because you can really pick up the vintage, if it was a good year, if it was a fire year, if it was a bad harvest, or if they, whatever the yeast was like that year. I mean, you can kind of pick those things up when you're drinking the wine, and that can be exciting. But if you want consistency, it can be difficult. There are a lot of organisms and bacteria and yeast out there that can spoil wine. So winemakers, they do get their hands in there and they add things that that might not be necessarily, well, they just add things. The point is that there is intervention to stop the wine from spoiling. Of course, this is in the end a business and a business, so they want to make sure that they're going to get the product at the end and that they're going to have satisfied customers. So that's USDA certified organic. You also have wines labeled made with organic grapes with no seal, kind of like I just mentioned about the produce at the farmer's market. Now that means they can contain 70% organic grapes. They can also add sulfites, but they can't be produced with the use of pesticides or synthetic fertilizers, okay? And wines must be produced and bottled in an organic facility. So those are some of the other criteria. And those wines can state on their labels that they've been made with organic grapes, but they can't get the seal, right? So again, because it's very specific criteria and obviously very specific certification costs as well. So that's sustainable, that's organic, that's USDA certified organic, and grapes made, grapes that are organic, or grown organically. And then next you have another level and another label, and that is one that's related primarily to the farming practices, and that's called biodynamic wine. Biodynamics, it's a holistic farming practice that originated from Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner in the 1920s. In order for vineyards and wineries to be certified biodynamic, they have to meet the strict standards set by the Demeter Association, like Demeter, like the Greek goddess, Demeter, Demeter. sometimes it's called Demeter Association. It's a nonprofit organization that certifies these biodynamic practices. Now, wines that carry the Demeter certification and thus are marked biodynamic or Demeter certified biodynamic, they have to meet minimum requirements for biodynamic farming, such as setting aside 10% of acreage for a biodiversity preserve, love that, and shunning synthetic pesticides and herbicides. But biodynamics also takes organic farming to another level by taking into account the different phases of the moon. And so they're required to harvest grapes when the moon is in a certain position, which it is believed by those who practice this, has a direct effect on the wine's character and behavior. Not really sure I buy that, but that's what that means to get labeled biodynamic. And something to keep in mind about biodynamic wines is that while wineries that consider themselves sustainable or organic, or neither, may use animals in their farming practices, right? It's much more common for biodynamic vineyards to do so. So you will often have goats, chickens, sheep who eat the wheat and eat the weeds around the grapevines, and whose waste and other ground up body parts, that sometimes happens as well, is used to fertilize the soil. So in the vineyards themselves, you do have a lot more of kind of this permaculture mentality in the vineyards when it's biodynamic. In terms of the wine itself, there's often inconsistency and unpredictability in the quality of biodynamic wine, kind of like what we talked about a little bit regarding some organic wines. So one vintage, read year, vintage just means the age of the wine. It might taste great, but another vintage of the same batch might not. Now, maybe that's okay for you because, like I said, some people consider biodynamic wines as time capsules, with the vintage variation kind of making the wine interesting. But there isn't a lot of science to substantiate certain aspects of biodynamic farming, like the concept of harvesting during the phases of the moon. You know, a lot of viticulturists will be in there. They're watching the grapes kind of every day, depending on what the rain is doing, depending on what the sun is doing, depending on what the soil is doing. And so to say that like, nah, it's only about when the moon is, you know, depending what the phases of the moon, that's, you know, I think there's not a lot to substantiate that. Now, biodynamic wines, they do employ organic practices, they do avoid pesticides, and they do depend on compost rather than chemical fertilizer. So again, a wine that's organic is not necessarily biodynamic, but a wine that's biodynamic is often organic. But if they do want to go through the USDA certification process, they'd have to do that separately. But my point is that you will find a lot of sustainable practices and organic practices in a wine that's biodynamic. But if a wine is certified organic, they're not necessarily practicing sustainable practices or even biodynamic. Does that make sense? So let's move on to the next category, if you will, of labeled wine, and that would be a wine that's called natural wine. It's also called low intervention wine, so that, as the name suggests, means that these wines are largely unmanipulated, similar to what I was saying about those Georgian wines, right? And they contain only trace amounts of added sulfites. Natural wines are those that are fermented spontaneously. We talked about that in the fermentation stage with native yeast, not added commercial yeast. These wines, now, so I mentioned that already in the biodynamic, right? That they will tend to use native yeast and they don't have sulfites. This natural wine has just trace amounts of added sulfites. But where the natural wine differs from, say, biodynamic is in the wine making process, whereby wines that are considered natural are also neither filtered nor fined, which means they may contain particulates or appear cloudy, since there may be dissolved solids that remain in suspension, and that's what makes a wine cloudy, right? And because animal products are not commonly accepted for use in natural wines wind up being vegan wines by default. Now, we're going to talk more about the vegan aspect in a little bit, but just so you know, those that are considered natural tend to be vegan by default in terms of the wine making process, in terms of the fining. Basically, this category is meant to define wines that have gone through the bare minimum in terms of chemical or winemaker intervention. These wines are often not aged in oak. With their lack of sulfites and other non-interventionist factors, these wines have typically limited stability, and they're produced in smaller quantities. These are not wines that would sit for a very long time because of what I just said. Now, can a natural wine be certified organic? Yes, if the grape growing adheres to the organic standards. But natural wines tend to have more to do with the wine making than with the grape growing. Can they also be biodynamic? Again, yes, so long as the winemaker employs the biodynamic requirements like the calendar and the phases of the moon and the composting, then they can apply for Demeter certification. Because it's more rigorous to have a wine labeled organic than natural, many winemakers just tend to dispense with these certifications and just go for we're natural, okay? So that's natural wine. That brings us to vegan wine. Now, generally speaking, people who look for wine that's considered vegan or called vegan are looking to make sure that no animal products were used in the making of the wine, particularly during the fining and filtration stages, if they take place at all. So let's revisit both fining and filtration, or I should just say, let's really focus on it because we didn't really talk about it much, which are different. Fining and filtration are different. And we're going to talk about that to understand why this happens in the first place and why animal products are sometimes used. So let's talk about fining. This is, F as in Frank, I-N-I-N-G, fining. All wines have proteins, tannins, phenolics, other tiny molecules, right? There's a lot going on in these in these tanks. And these are natural. They pose absolutely no threat, but any of them in excess can cause various problems, such as, if you have little molecules or you have little microbes, it could cause the wine to keep fermenting, like in the bottle, right? If yeasts are still in the bottle, you don't want that. You want to control exactly what happens with this wine by the time it gets into the bottle. You don't want more you don't want more processes to take place other than you knowing that as it sits in the bottle, it's going to age more. And you know that, but you don't want it to keep fermenting, right? Also, tannins. All red wines contain tannins, of course, which come from the grape skins and the grape seeds. And tannins are, in and of themselves, fine. You want them. They're compounds that, by definition, they bind with proteins. Now, in your mouth, the wine tannins bind to your salivary proteins, which lubricate your mouth. And that's one of the things that gives wine the astringency that it has, or the grip. When you talk about, you can really taste those tannins. I mean, that's one of the descriptions when you're drinking wine. But in excess, they can make a wine rough and coarse and austere. So the solution is to fine out the excess tannin. And since tannins bind to protein, adding a protein to a red wine will reduce the amount of tannin in that wine. So this is another one of these interventions where the winemaker is really controlling how much tannin they want in a wine. So the traditional protein used is albumin, which is from egg whites. And even though they might use egg whites during production, wine producers don't have to include egg whites on the label because they are removed before bottling. They're removed from the final product. Okay? So hold that thought. When white wines are fined, it's for the opposite reasons as red. There's too much protein. So protein in white wines doesn't affect the flavor, but it can create a hazy appearance rather than a clear, bright appearance. That's kind of how we think when we think about a Sauvignon Blanc, right? When you think of that I'm not going to say Chardonnay because that can actually be a little I'm gonna say cloudy, hazy, but a Sauvignon Blanc, right, or a Riesling, you're imagining just this clear, crisp, bright appearance. But if you have too many proteins in your white wine, you're going to have an appearance that's a bit hazy and cloudy, and the consumer would notice it. You'd be able to tell, right? So a clay known as bentonite is added to the wine, and that clay attracts the protein particles, and that clay bound protein then settles to the bottom, and the clean protein free wine is strained of the sediment. So that's why you would fine a white wine. Now, in addition to the egg whites and to bentonite, other fining agents include activated charcoal, silica gel, gelatin, obviously made from slaughterhouse waste or comes from slaughterhouse waste, casein, which is a milk protein, isinglass, which is a collagen type protein derived from fish bladders, and other mineral and plant-based fining agents that are becoming more common. But as you can see, the consistency here, the thread in all of these is protein. That's what you're looking for to bind with the proteins or to bind with the tannin in the wine. Now, there's speculation as to whether or not fining is actually even needed in winemaking practices. Most young wines, if they're left long enough, will eventually reach the same state as fining achieves after a few months. But as I said, winemakers want to be able to control, say, the tannin levels, for instance, and some larger winemakers, they don't want to wait for this natural process to occur because they want to just get their wines out to market, okay? So that's fining. Filtering wines is different. But you'll hear filtered you'll hear filtering and fining used interchangeably, but that's just not the case. While unfiltered and unfined are often seen on wine labels together, there isn't a link. They're not the same thing. Fining clarifies wine by binding to suspended particles and precipitating out larger particles, as we said. Filtration works by passing the wine through a filter medium made up of very small holes or pores, similar to a coffee filter, that captures particles larger than the medium's holes, right? And then you just, there you go. You get your particles out. People tend to talk about filtering and fining as both using animal products, but that's not true. Fining uses the animal products when animal products are used. Filtering doesn't. So the big question is, how do you know if a wine has been fined? And how do you know if a wine has been fined using animal products? Well, there is no regulatory body for vegan wines. There are some independent certifiers. Again, these are always third-party certifiers, just like the sustainable and the biodynamic and all of these are third-party certifiers that deem if a wine is vegan if the wine doesn't use animal products in the fining process. And it looks like, I was looking at who might be doing this in the vegan world. bveg.com, B-E-V-E-G, bveg.com looks like they're the main one. There might be others as well. But in general, regulations in the EU, the European Union, or the US, they don't require wineries to list fining agents on labels. And wine, like other alcoholic drinks, is exempt from the detailed ingredient labeling imposed on foodstuffs, right? Because in theory, as I said, fining agents should not remain in the final wine. However, more and more wine retailers and producers have started to help consumers make a choice by highlighting which of their wines are vegan friendly. So it's a matter of asking. And when you do, I think you'll find that many wines are vegan friendly, as animal-based fining agents are being replaced by products based on the clays mentioned earlier, even on vegetables such as pea protein and potato protein that do a similar job. But the most surefire way, aside from looking for wines that choose to put vegan friendly or vegan or suitable for vegans on their label, to be honest, if you want just a surefire way to know that the wine hasn't been fined, it's really, you're going to look for natural wine or unfined or even unfiltered, because it's used interchangeably on the label. Wines that are unfined wouldn't use any fining agents at all. And so that's how you'll know 100% that animal products weren't used, because they're not fining at all. Same with unfiltered wines. So even though I said earlier, the filtering process doesn't typically use animal products, but if you see unfiltered, you can probably bet that they're also unfined because they tend to be used interchangeably and simultaneously, even though they're different things. And therefore, either or both on a label would indicate that no animal products were used in the making of the wine. How else? Well, there are more and more resources doing the work for you. Veganwines.com, Barnivore. You can also search online and find countless blog posts naming specific wines and specific wineries. I don't tend to use these sources, however, and I'll tell you why in a bit. But you can definitely search online for vegan wines, and you'll come up with a lot of different wines. But I want to talk about this a little bit more. That explains why you'll hear vegans talk about vegan wine and why I'm asked this question all the time. But I think, surprise, surprise, that this issue is much more complex than such a simple label would indicate. And it goes back to the other categories I talked about first, namely sustainability as it relates to the growing of the grapes in the vineyards themselves before the wine is even brought to the winery. Because in my opinion, a crucial aspect of all agriculture is the extent to which it harms or protects wildlife, habitats, ecosystems, watersheds, etc. For instance, a wine labeled vegan may not use animal products in the fining, but they may use pesticides in the vineyard. They may trap or poison or kill wild animals in the vineyard. They may cut down a forest or a portion of a forest to expand the vineyard. This goes for any agricultural crop, frankly. And as you get certifications for vegan, you may wind up having certifications and the criteria requiring those things. But right now, that's not really what vegan wine is about. Vegan wine tends to be specifically about using fining agents, period, in the wine making. So for me, that is a huge difference in terms of wine making and wine growing or grape growing, right? For me, it's not just about not having a wine that did or did not use animal products as fining agents or even chicken manure as fertilizer, because that's something you're hearing a bit about more in vegan labeling or what criteria people are using for vegan wines. So you're going to see a little bit more about that, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second as well. But for me, that's still too simplistic. For me, it's about having a holistic approach where the viticulturists, people who grow the grapes, and the vintners, people who make the wines, work together to choose the most sustainable practices overall, from vineyard to bottle. Because, as we have talked about ad nauseum, as I have talked about ad nauseum for the last 22 years, where do you draw the line? What about a winery that's labeled vegan because their fining agents aren't animal-based, but where animals play a role in their vineyards? So, for instance, I know some wineries that use draft horses to plow vineyard rows, right? The plowing keeps weeds down. The winemaker might say that the using horses delivers less pressure on the dirt than a tractor does. Obviously, you get less compact soil. You get more room for nature's microorganisms to nourish the vines. It's not petroleum based, right? So you're right. That's one example. Now, I'm not saying I support this. I'm just saying, I'm giving you an example. And you might say, no, if I knew a winery, or frankly, you'd have to include any type of farm, including farms that grow your food or your coffee or your tea, use draft horses or draft animals, I wouldn't support them. No. Okay, well, what about dogs? I've heard of wineries that are training the family dog to sniff out the grapevine mealybug before it can wreak havoc on a vineyard, right? The dog's sensitive nose can identify infected vines before the pest can spread. And so this dog is a family dog. He's loved and cherished, and he has a home for life, but he's being trained for this purpose. Some vegans would say no. And then I realize that there's going to be some vegans who say no to anything. And there's going to be some vegans who don't even think having dogs or cats as companions is vegan. So they may say no, that's not okay. What about a winery that brings falcons to the vineyards to scare away grape-loving starlings during harvest? Or that has owl boxes to encourage raptors to naturally keep down the rodent population, right? I mean, isn't that better than using herbicides or other invasive or harmful treatments, right? In terms of kind of, again, holistic, eco-friendly approaches. Now, of course, you also have the biodynamic farms, but there's also farms that are not biodynamic that just have sheep or goats or chickens or geese for weed and snail control. And again, this goes for produce growers as well. And I'm saying produce growers, obviously grape is a produce, but produce that we eat, right? That we just eat directly from the farm, right? They might also use animals in their farms, right? But in terms of winemaking, if they don't use animal products as fining agents, are vegans okay with the sheep being used or geese? Or maybe you don't even know. What about a wine that's labeled vegan because they don't fine using animal products, and they also don't use animals or animal products in their vineyards, but at events they sell animal-based food. They sell dairy-based cheeses and animal meats, or they have food pairing recipes on their website that are meat and cheese heavy. Is that okay? And if not, then what? Any of these things would rule out then buying wines that are eco-friendly and sustainable and responsible in other ways, especially for me, especially those that are sustainability minded, right? So even if they might be vegan in the sense of not using fining agents that are animal based, what about these other things? What about, we have a winery we love, and we love all of their practices, but we've been to their events. They always have something for vegans to eat, but they also have animal products. But I love that winery, and I love how they make their wine, and I love their sustainability ethic. So where do you draw the line? You see what I'm getting at? Ticking all of these boxes isn't easy. Just as when we're trying to make informed decisions about farmers or stores we buy produce from. Like, I don't buy produce from supermarkets. I'm just going to say it right now. I buy our produce. 95% of the produce I buy is from our farmers market every week. Local farmers. And even then, I don't know all of their practices. I mean, these are small family farms whose crops are grown just a few miles from our home. And I love supporting them. And I love the produce. And I love talking to the farmers. I love eating seasonally. But I can't and don't know all the practices of every one of the farmers. I know some, but I don't know all. And also, things change. Just like with vineyards and vintners, depending on what the weather is like or how our crop is doing, or if there were fires that year, different decisions have to be made all the time about how to save that year's crop or how to intervene in some way so that you get the best wine possible. Also, not all wineries have their own vineyards. This is something to consider too. Many contract with different vineyards. So asking a wine seller or a retailer or even a salesperson at the winery, they may not know every single practice that occurs on the farm they contract with. Now, the winery should know, to be honest, because they contract with the vineyards for a particular reason, and the winemakers and the viticulturists tend to work together to make sure the grapes they grow and the wine they make is consistent and high standard. But what about cheaper wines or large commercial wineries? Standards are very different if you're buying a $30 bottle of wine from a local winery and a local vineyard versus $2 chuck at Trader Joe's, right? The point is, we can and we should make informed decisions about what we buy and who we support, but it's not going to be perfect. And the criteria may vary depending on what your goal is. That's why I often say that vegan is not my goal. Like, my goal is not to wear a vegan badge. Doing the very best I can to live compassionately and sustainably and consciously and healthfully, that's my goal. And in this complex, imperfect world, that's just not black and white. Even though some vegans think there's only one vegan line and it's hard and fast, I don't agree. I don't think there's one line, or Maybe I would say that there is one vegan line, but it moves from time to time. So in the end, it's going to be a matter of what you're looking to support. So how do you do that? You can seek out the websites of the organizations that certify wineries and the various topics we discussed. You can go look for SIP, right? Sustainable California, what have you, SIP, organic through the USDA, or biodynamic through Demeter, or vegan through beeveg.com. Many such organizations will have databases on their websites, so you can search and browse through them, right? But here's the problem. With relying on certifications, not all wineries that practice the things we're discussing do or want to go through the certification process, as I said earlier. Some don't want to be part of what can feel, and often is, just a marketing label. Some don't want to go through the expense. Some don't feel that a single label reflects the practices they care about, but they might pretty much do everything that those criteria require to get that certification, but not everything. They might do a couple things slightly differently, and so it doesn't match. But in every other way, they might be, kind of ticking the boxes for you. So just because a wine or a winery or a vineyard isn't listed on one of those certification websites, it doesn't mean they aren't embracing the practices you might care about. So outside of looking at labels, how do you know if you're buying from wineries with practices you do care about? Ask them. Or go to their website. A lot of wineries will have information on their website about how they make their wine and how they grow their grapes. Again, remember, if they don't have estate wines mean wines that are made from grapes grown right on their estate, right on their property, right, in their own vineyards. Then they might have their vineyards practices right there, and they might introduce you to the winemaker and to the viticulturist, but they might also contract with vineyards, and they might have the name of those vineyards on the website, but not the specific practices. So it's just hard to know. But still, reach out to the wineries, check out their website, follow them on social media, ask them questions, and yes, you can see you will drive yourself a little mad trying to be perfect in all of this. Because even though we, David and I, we are members of a number of wineries we know and we love, we're California Zinfandel fans, so if you like California Zinfandel, even though they make other wines as well, but the wineries we belong to include, but are not limited to, Turley, Rosenbloom, Peachy Canyon, Mazzocco, Limerick Lane. They make some of the best zins you will ever drink, but they also make some other really great wines. Anyway, we know about these wineries, but we certainly don't ask about the winemaking process every time we're handed a glass of wine at a party or at an event or at a friend's house or a neighbor's house, or every time someone gifts us with a bottle of wine, or every time we visit a winery. I mean, when we go to wineries, we're usually picking them for a specific reason, mostly because we've heard they make good wines of the varietals we like, also because of the experience we want to have, because the location is beautiful, or the vineyards look lovely, or we could have a special experience at them. And so we'll do a little research before we go to a winery, because we want to know more. And to be clear, on our Joyful Vegan trips, the wineries we go to and the wine we drink, we do choose them because we have the time and luxury to do so. And they're all vegan wines. So just so you know, if you're ever traveling on a Joyful Vegan trip, that is an occasion where we do make a conscious decision to make sure all the wines are vegan wines. But generally speaking, just like I don't ask about the farming practices of every piece of produce I put in my mouth at a restaurant, or every drop of tea I drink at a cafe, or whether I'm eating cane sugar or beet sugar that was filtered through animal products when I'm eating vegan baked goods, or someone gives me a vegan cupcake, right? Or I'm at a vegan in the end, we just do the best we can to live a compassionate life that is also joyful and enjoyable. It can already be challenging or time-consuming, and sometimes even exhausting to make the most conscious choices as vegans. And as someone who tries to live zero waste, someone who tries to live sustainably, yeah, sometimes it's like, oh my God, I just want to do this thing. And I'm trying to do the best I can, but I would be miserable if I dissected every single solitary thing I do and buy. And believe me, I already do more than most. And this goes to something I've said in podcast episodes in the past, and I will say in my book about zero waste and sustainability, for the onus to be only on the consumer, it's not reasonable and it's not fair. And so I will tell you this, the cheaper the wine and the larger the winery, the higher the likelihood that they don't implement eco-friendly and animal-friendly practices, and B, the lower the likelihood that you're going to actually find out what their practices are. So when it comes to wine you drink most, spend a little more and get to know the winery a bit more. Become a member, ask them questions. And then the wines you're drinking at home and the wines that you really do love, then you know the most about them. And in the rest of your life and the rest of your experiences, just like when it comes to the food you're eating, when you're given food that is plant-based, that is vegan, that is not made with animal products, you don't ask about the practices, you don't ask if it's vegan, you don't ask if fertilizer was used, you don't ask if animals were used in the growing of the, in the growing of the carrots, right? In the rest of your life, just relax, just enjoy. And where you decide to draw your vegan line is up to you. For me, while making the decision on where that line is, I can't help thinking about what's best for the larger movement, I'll say, for lack of a better word, in general, and how we can make this lifestyle, for lack of a better word, as attractive as possible that others want to follow. I say that because I find that when we focus on the minute, nitty-gritty things like fining agents in wine, it becomes a distraction from what is the biggest and most solvable issue, which is the fact that we kill over 9 billion land animals, 45 billion land and aquatic animals together every year in the United States alone, which is why it's so prevalent and so cheap to use animal products like egg albumin and bone and gelatin in the processing of products or in the final products of foods that should be purely plant-based. So for me, I think we need to focus on reducing the number of animals bred only to be killed, and therein we'll find the solution to animal products being used in processing or as byproducts. When animal products are more expensive, i.e. when the demand goes down, and pray tell we eliminate government subsidies, animal byproducts will be more expensive and less appealing to use. And while there are plenty of fining agents that can and are being used right now, such as the carbon, I mentioned the bentonite clay and limestone, there's plant casein, there's silica gel. I think in the very near future, we're also going to see more slaughter-free gelatins and eggs and casein, right? Made from cellular agriculture, made by the innovative companies that are increasing every day. I am absolutely hopeful about that. I absolutely believe that as we slowly move towards a more compassionate world, the compassionate processes will replace the animal-based ones. I also think that one of the ways we're going to be able to attract others to adopt a compassionate way of living now is to relax a little about things we may not have any control over, like the processing and the fining of such things as wine, where animal products are not in the final product. I say this because where I think people will have the most impact is in the elimination of meat, dairy, and eggs from their diet. There are enough barriers to that and enough people who feel like that is hard enough. So leading a conversation by saying, well, glad you're doing that, but watch out for wine too. Not all wine is vegan. I think that's a huge mistake. I think that is a huge deterrent for people. I hear so many non-vegans say, when I'm talking to them about the joys and benefits of living vegan, they might say like, okay, what about wine? Like, don't tell me I have to give up wine, right? I mean, they're looking for ways to say, okay, I can do this, but like, don't take this away too. And of course, my answer is don't do nothing because you can't do everything. Do something. Anything. Don't not eliminate meat, dairy, and eggs from your diet because wine may or may not be processed with animal products. And they get that. they can wrap their brains around that. But if I said, yeah, sorry, wine and beer, oh, and sometimes sugar, oh, and the tires on your car and the water that comes through your pipes, yeah, they were probably made with some kind of animal product in the process as well. Oh, and you should also find out if the farms you're buying your produce from is practicing veganic agriculture and not using animal products as fertilizer. Oh, and the animals aren't used at the farm at all. Can you imagine? Seriously? Like, who wouldn't throw up their hands and be like, okay, well, I'm out. Like, what's the point, right? So that's not to say that a discussion should never happen. Indeed, as we move towards a more compassionate world, we can focus on these smaller issues that will be relatively easy to fix when we're eliminating the larger instances of animal exploitation and slaughter. And also, as individuals, that naturally happens. You can read about this in The Joyful Vegan. This is what I talk about. Naturally, once we tackle the big stuff, like eliminating animal-based meat, dairy, and eggs from our diet, we all tend to go through the process of learning about all the ways in which animals are harmed in our society. That's why you have this trajectory of vegetarian to vegan, or in my case, right, vegetarian or pescatarian, vegetarian, vegan, and now like zero waste, right? Because we just expansion, like that's what we do. We look at all the other ways that we can do the best we can. So that happens. That happens very naturally. And then we all decide where we want to draw that line so that we can all live as compassionately and consciously as possible, but also joyfully and socially. I do think that as you go down the rabbit hole of vegan purity, you completely lose the meaning and joy of what it means to live compassionately, what it means to live as a joyful vegan. The veganism I practice is about abundance and joy and inclusion. And I think that's going to be a lot more appealing to others if they see that it's not about what they lose when they become vegan, but about what they gain. And oh my goodness, there is so much to gain from living according to our own values of compassion and kindness. For the animals, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening.